Our first speaker is an international expert in the area of lifelong learning for people with disabilities. Professor Sheila Radel will speak on this topic. She is Professor of Inclusion and Diversity and also is Director of the Centre for Research in Education, Inclusion and Diversity at the Moray House School of Education in the University of Edinburgh. She previously worked as Director of the Strathclyde Centre for Disability Research at the University of Glasgow. Her research interests are in the broad field of equality and social inclusion, with particular reference to lifelong learning, inclusion and diversity, and also to equality and human rights. She has explored additional support needs and the widening of access to higher education. Sheila's very widely published in these fields, and she's currently working on projects investigating lifelong learning policy, higher education, and special and inclusive education across Europe. So it is with great pleasure that I invite Sheila to address us. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Sheila. It's good to have two Sheilas on the stage. It's only people of our age who ever get called Sheila now, I notice, which is quite amusing. Anyway, it's lovely to be here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference. As Sheila has already said, I'm going to talk about a range of projects that I've been involved in. So this is an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be drawing on a whole range of different evidence to look at the post-school destinations in Scotland of young people with learning disabilities, looking at the barriers, the support, and progress towards independent adulthood. And I think it's important to take note of this terminology that applies in Scotland but doesn't apply in England, and I don't think you use similar terminology in Ireland. So the term ASN, additional support needs, includes school-aged children and young people who have difficulty in learning for any reason at all, for social reasons as well as cognitive, sensory impairments, physical impairments, everybody. And controversially, it includes groups like children who do not have English as their first language. Now, actually, I wasn't in favour of the inclusion of that group because I think it potentially has racist undertones, and I think certainly the UN would agree with that. So some of this broad umbrella is quite controversial. There's also, of course, this disjunction with adult services when we no longer talk about additional support needs but talk about disabled people or people with disabilities. But in any case, Scotland introduced this massively large umbrella category under the terms of 2004 legislation, and as a result, it appeared that we suddenly had a massive increase in the proportion of young people who were having additional support needs recognised. Across Scotland at the moment, now 27% of the school-age population is ostensibly recognised as having additional support needs. And in some local authorities, it's as high as 37%. And I think my view of that is that when it gets as large as that, what does it actually mean in practice? Sometimes in Scotland, the government may assume that just simply saying somebody has additional support needs means that provision, additional support, is actually being delivered. But that is very, very far from the case, and there's actually no research that looks at what this actually means in practice. But I think spreading the umbrella so wide can actually have possibly more disbenefits rather than benefits. I've kind of interspersed this talk with a few pictures because I think it's really good to remind ourselves all the time that we're talking about real people here. So I'm actually going to focus on evidence from a few projects, and I'll try and mention which projects I'm talking about. But you can have a look at all of our all of our work on our website. When we're doing research, we always try and publish little summaries of what we're doing and also working papers, briefings, and so on. So I will, before the end of the talk, give you this website, and you're really welcome to go on there and download anything that you want to. I'm specifically referring to 3 projects today. The broad thinking of lifelong learning is drawn from a project that I worked on really quite some time ago, nearly 20 years ago, which was called The Meaning of the Learning Society for Adults with Learning Difficulties. I don't know if you can remember back that far. There was a big focus on lifelong learning at that point, which has slightly fallen out of vogue. And most of the projects funded under this big ESRC programme were not at all to do with learning difficulties or social disadvantage. It was much more to do with knowledge societies, competitive learning, knowledge economies, and so on. So our project was a kind of antidote to thinking, to asking questions about what this meant for people at the social margins. We've also done research over the years for the voluntary sector, bodies like the National Deaf Children's Society in 2012, focusing specifically on the transitions of young people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And the project I'm working on at the moment, which is proving extremely interesting, is a joint project with the University of Manchester, again funded by the ESRC. And it's asking questions about the rights of children and young people and how these fit in to what we're delivering in schools and post-school provision at the moment. And it's, I suppose, drawing on broad philosophical ideas about human autonomy and what this actually means in practice. And of course, it's not without controversy because the Scottish Government is now really committed to incorporating the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic legislation. And I'm sure that the Irish Government has made similar commitments. But since we're operating at a time of squeezed resources, what does this actually mean? And we've actually found that quite a lot of people are not opposed to the idea of children's rights and human rights in general. Indeed, how could you be? But it's saying, if you place the responsibility for the delivery of high-quality services onto the shoulders of children, young people, and adults, let's say with learning disabilities, what does this mean? What position are people in to actually challenge what's being provided and make demands on the system? And where does this leave parents who are very often the strongest advocates? It's always, of course, interesting doing comparisons across the UK and across Europe, because even though at the moment we're all part of the EU, we do have very different systems, and there is always policy learning to be done by looking at how things are being done differently. In fact, in this particular case, Scotland has gone a lot further than England in terms of incorporating human rights and children's rights into law. But when we look at practice on the ground, we often find that a lot of this is rhetorical rather than anything to do with reality. So as I've already said, there is this very strong rhetorical commitment to the rights of disabled people, the rights of children, and the human rights agenda generally. And there's also, of course, in Scotland, a concern to ratchet up attainment levels of the entire population. Scotland had a bit of a shock because, of course, everybody knows that Scottish education is the best in the world, but in the last round of PISA, that was me being slightly jokey there, in the last round of PISA, we found that Scotland was actually falling behind. And particularly in comparison with England, Scottish young people are now doing worse in literacy, numeracy and science. So the Scottish Government felt that urgent action was called for. But by and large, it doesn't provide very, very useful data. It tends to have positive destinations on transition as the most important thing that is measured. And in fact, positive destinations is such a broad brush measure that it includes virtually everybody. So 96% of school leavers in Scotland have some sort of positive outcome. And it can include something like what's called an activity agreement, where the young person is involved in some sort of life skills development or confidence boosting activity. So it really is not very strong. So, but we still have differences in terms of different groups. So whereas 96% of the population is attaining a positive destination up here, for people with learning disabilities, it's less than 80%. And the 20% who are not there have kind of disappeared from the system altogether. They're simply invisible now. Nobody knows at all what they're doing. Going directly from school into a daycare centre would be counted as a positive destination, although many people might think that wasn't very positive. Social, emotional and behavioural difficulties is another category in Scotland, which I think is increasingly concerning. In that particular category, we have mainly boys, and mainly boys from very poor backgrounds. It's an entirely stigmatised category. Nobody chooses it. There is no voluntary association that speaks for children who get this label, and it's the biggest and fastest growing category of all additional support needs in Scotland. And 20% of this group, slightly more, are vanishing when they leave school. Again, if we look at interrupted learning, that includes children of travellers, children who have very, very disrupted lifestyles and move schools frequently. And this group, actually in both Scotland and England, has the very worst educational outcomes, and they are declining, not improving over time. In the research that I do, I always like to do in-depth qualitative work, but I think it's always really important to root it in a bigger picture. So our work always involves analysis of administrative data, plus surveys and so on. And that's what I'm giving you, I think, a flavour of today. So this chart is looking at the destinations of school leavers with and without ASN, drawn from Scottish Government data in 2018. And again, you get the impression that people who do have some sort of diagnosis or identification of ASN are doing worse than other people. So in terms of activity agreement, we can see that people with any additional support are more likely to be in that category than people with no additional support needs, the red group. We find that people with no additional support are more likely to be moving from school into employment, although that's a really quite small group now. Scarcely anybody goes from school into employment. If we look at further education, it's interesting because we find that a higher proportion of people with some sort of additional support needs are in that group compared with no additional support. But that includes people who are moving from some sort of special setting or some sort of additional support in mainstream into special support in colleges. And we have found that college special courses are often leading to this cycle of endless training, of churn within the system. And I would say that this is a problem that we've identified. You go from school where you get quite intensive support to college, again special provision, less intensive support, and then there's a huge gulf and nobody really knows what's going to happen after that. So even though this might look quite promising, having such a wide group, a big group in further education, it's not necessarily so. If we look at higher education, 40% or more of Scottish young people are now going into some sort of higher education. That includes sub-degree programmes delivered in college, a big group in Scotland. And we find that 47.3% of people with no additional support needs are going into some sort of higher education, compared with 20.5% of people with additional support needs. So there is a very, very big inequality there. And as I'm going to demonstrate, people who are moving into higher education are much more likely to be in employment of some sort. So even though some people feel that, you do hear too many people going into higher education, blah, 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 this group is really protected against some of the risks of unemployment in knowledge societies, in the types of economy that we're living in at the moment. So again, I want to draw attention to, again, a few of the differences. When we talk about ASN or no ASN, that's very, very broad brush, because as I've said, ASN includes so many different groups. So this is looking at two different types of destination, higher education and further education. Here we can compare learning disability, dyslexia here, visual impairment here, and autistic spectrum disorder. And we find that with this group here, this is autistic spectrum disorder, we're finding that 17.8% are moving into higher education, compared with nearly 50% of other groups. And again, dyslexia, which is actually quite a middle class group, when we look at the social class composition of different groups, we find that those with dyslexia are the only group who are more likely to come from middle class backgrounds. Everybody else is more likely to come from a socially disadvantaged background. So again, higher education does tell us something interesting, and there are some interesting messages from further education. But just moving on, a lot of this may be explained by different levels of school attainment. And this figure here shows people with no ASN compared with people with hearing impairment. So hearing impairment, of course, some young people with hearing impairment do have other difficulties as well, but many just have a hearing impairment. And so you would sort of expect that this group would be fairly close to the mainstream population in terms of school attainment. But in fact, this isn't what we find at all. When we look at people getting 5+, Level 6 is higher, which is the gold standard for getting into university in Scotland. So we find that people with no ASN are much more likely to have 5+ hires compared with people with hearing impairment, where it's very low, it's just over 5%. And of course, as we go down the levels, we find that as their highest attainment, there are more people who are deaf or hearing impaired getting the kind of lowest level of educational attainment at school. And as we go towards the more demanding levels, we find that the differences between the groups, no ASN or hearing impairment, gets bigger and bigger. This is advanced higher level, which would be the equivalent of A-levels in England. So again, you can see that there are real problems in school attainment, and in the work that we've done recently, I've been spending a lot of time in schools doing field work for our current project. And I observe over and over that the levels of attainment that are expected by and large of young people with learning disabilities are not very high, particularly young people with social, emotional and behavioural difficulties. In fact, one development that I think is a little bit worrying in Scotland is that there is an increasing emphasis on flexi education for this group, which again, you might think sounds pretty good. But what is happening is that Scotland, again, wants to reduce levels of exclusion, but one of the ways that it's doing this is allowing children with social, emotional and behavioural difficulties, the ones that the teachers really don't like having in class very much, they're saying to them, well, you can do partial timetable. So you can only come into school, let's say, for half time or even less. And there are huge issues there in terms of basic rights. I mean, it is one of the articles of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, a right to education. And yet we're finding that many young people with social, emotional and behavioural difficulties, ostensibly in their own interests, are not getting a full-time education. And yet this is probably the group that has the greatest need of it, because they very often had very disrupted and impoverished backgrounds. So I would say that a lot comes back to what we expect children to achieve at school level. And we've probably improved in terms of the level of care that's delivered in schools. But we're not often making high academic demands on children who could actually achieve a lot more. When we look across the piece at post-school transition planning, the law does say that every young person with additional support needs should have a post-school transition plan. But in fact, this hardly ever is happening at the moment. One thing that we've done in Scotland, and I think again that England possibly has a better system in this regard, we've gone for a highly deregulated system. So we are meant to have things called statutory support plans, coordinated support plans, which were meant to be the equivalent of the record of needs. The record of needs was abolished in 2004, and about 2% of children had records of needs. We now have only 0.1% of children having coordinated support plans, and they're effectively dying out because local authorities are saying they're too much work, we don't like committing resources to individual children, and it's better if people, well, I know that this is probably exaggerating, but because rights to go to the tribunal and so on are associated with having a CSP, if you don't have a CSP, you're actually foregoing a lot of the rights that you have in law. So the only people now who have CSPs are people with very, very well-educated and knowledgeable parents who know how to work the system. So we have found in our analyses that whereas you're much more likely to be identified as having additional support needs if you come from a poor, disadvantaged background, you're much less likely to have a CSPs. CSPs are given to a tiny proportion now of children from richer backgrounds. And of course, there's a huge social justice issue associated with those things, which kind of links into the rights agenda generally, because rights fundamentally depends on individuals being in a position to claim their rights. And if they are not knowledgeable about rights, and if they don't have the support they need, the rights become fairly meaningless. So even though in law people are meant to have transition plans, they don't have them. Whether the plans will be useful is another matter, but nonetheless. We do find that school leavers with ASN who go to university are in a much better position than others. And of course, there's a chicken and egg situation going on here anyway. They tend to come from more advantaged backgrounds. The vast majority of students in our university, 60% of all disabled students, have dyslexia, who are more likely to be middle class than the rest of the population. So they have probably worked the system by paying for private psychological assessments, getting extra time in exams, and so on. But once they're at university, they continue to benefit from parental support very often. Parents go to the university and discuss things with disability advisors. But people, young people from poor backgrounds, do not get any of that support. The young people from the less advantaged backgrounds we find who go into FE or some sort of training or activity agreements tend to have much more limited social, economic and cultural capital. They're much more on their own, and they also have difficulties now in securing benefits. As you may well know, in the UK, there has been a massive transition over to a thing called universal credit, which was meant to encourage people to seek employment. But because it wasn't a bad idea, actually, to have some kind of taper between work and not work, but because it's been implemented during a period of austerity, it has resulted in a great deal of hardship for many people. And the UN rapporteur, who has just issued a report on poverty in the UK, has underlined this over just the last week. So these people are having great difficulty not only in finding things to do, meaningful things that might actually lead towards a job, but they're also having great difficulty in securing various benefits. So experience of higher education. I have actually made these points already, so I'll skip over these. The people we've found who have gone into higher education have generally had pretty good self-advocacy skills, better parental support. Actually, universities now in Scotland and the rest of the UK have pretty generous disability services. It doesn't mean that it's perfect for everybody. There are still groups who fall through the cracks, particularly people with mental health difficulties. But by and large, disabled students are the most advantaged of everybody in this age group. Further education and training is much more patchy, and we have found evidence of far more discriminatory attitudes in training placements, not so much in further education, but certainly in trading placements, a lack of awareness and a lack of reasonable adjustments that should be provided under the terms of the Equality Act. And there are far fewer instances of self-advocacy and of parental support. These young people who have fewer resources are much more on their own at an earlier age. So inevitably, these different earlier experiences lead to different post-school experiences leading on into the labour market. So this is interesting in terms of employment rates, the marked variation by type of disability. In the UK at the moment, we have very high employment. In fact, it's 80% overall, which includes all the people who are, it includes students actually, but it also includes people who may be looking after young children and so on. So very high employment rates, although we do have many people in fairly low-skilled jobs with pretty low levels of pay. Poverty in the UK is actually strongly associated with having a job. Many jobs are not paying enough for people to get by. But then when we look at the categories of disability, and of course you'll notice that the categories change completely when we're looking at the adult population. They're much more medicalised, so we have diabetes, difficulty in hearing, difficulty in seeing, depression, anxiety, mental illness, learning disabilities. You can see a huge difference here, with only 10% of people with learning disabilities being in employment in the UK, contrasting with nearly 80% of the general population. And of course, people with mental illness, depression, anxiety are also having much lower employment rates. People with diabetes and those sorts of conditions have lower employment rates. But in the UK, because we have such a punitive system associated with claiming benefits, if you don't have a job, you are really in a pretty poor position socially, which is bound to have an impact on your degree of social participation. You haven't got enough money to live on. You may be struggling with something like the bedroom tax, where you're being forced to move into small accommodation because the number of people in the family doesn't warrant the size of property, of social housing that you actually have. There are many ways in which people are punished for being disabled and not having work. When we compare the position of disabled graduates, we find interestingly that disabled graduates have much better employment outcomes. So this is contrasting the post-graduation outcomes of the non-disabled population and the disabled population. These are graduates only. And we find that non-disabled people are much more likely to be moving straight into work. In fact, over time, they have almost full employment. So this is immediately post-graduation. For disabled graduates, it's slightly less good, people moving straight into employment. For deaf hearing impairment, it's slightly better than for disabled people generally. Now, of course, this is a very strong argument for encouraging as many disabled people as possible into higher education. But there will always be people who are never going to make it into higher education. And so we need, I think, to be spending a lot more time thinking about what is actually happening to that group. And in fact, when we do look at what is happening to people who don't progress into higher education, and this includes people who are non-disabled as well as disabled people, we do have a big issue in the UK in terms of very poor quality provision. There's a big emphasis on apprenticeships, and of course there are a very few things called higher level apprenticeships which are equivalent to degree level study. But most apprenticeships in England and in Scotland are delivered by the private sector, and the apprenticeships at level 1 or level 2 pretty much consist of the types of jobs like shelf stacking in supermarkets, when people are not really learning any very useful skills that are going to be transferable and that are ever going to lead to secure employment with possibility for progression and so on. So there is clearly a problem there. What we found in terms of comparing the early labour market experiences of disabled people with different levels of qualification, we find that some problems are common to all, like maybe difficulties in applying for work. Certainly people with hearing impairment do have those difficulties, and discrimination in recruitment practices, and lack of disability awareness in the workforce. These are common. But when we look at disabled people with lower qualifications, they have all these additional burdens and risks: lack of work experience, limited social networks, and lack of support employment. And it's very interesting that the social networks, in terms of getting your first job, are still enormously important and are drawn upon much more extensively by middle-class people than others. And in terms of leading on to the established markers of adulthood, which most people, whether you're disabled or non-disabled, these are the things that you want to achieve. You want to achieve independent living. You want to be able to move to get a job if you can't get a job close to home. Financial independence, so much flows from not being dependent on your parents any longer. Links to wider social networks and being able to plan a career. And again, those things are very often elusive for disabled people. Our study of the meaning of the Learning Society of Adults with Learning Difficulties found evidence over and over again of these cycles of training, endless cycles of training, that were leading people away from rather than towards the labour market. And we actually found some people approaching retirement who had never managed to get a job, even though that had been what they'd been striving for. One man said to us, a man with learning difficulties, "I feel trained enough now." And you know, you have to sympathise with somebody who has been endlessly encouraged to participate in training, and often the training schemes are job creation schemes for the people who are running them, not for people who are participating in them. So we certainly, I imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine that that is a problem in Ireland as well as a problem in the UK. But I can certainly say from evidence that it's a problem in the UK. So now, just coming back to the human stories behind the statistics, I wanted to tell you a little bit about one of the young women who has been a case study in the current work that I mentioned, the work on autonomy and rights. This is a young woman who we call Janet. She is in post-16 provision. She's actually 23 years old now. She has learning disabilities. And interestingly, she's at quite a progressive place, which is based on the principles of lifelong learning. So even though many young people with learning disabilities eventually find their way into day centres, which are really not particularly popular at the moment because they're much more places where people are almost warehoused rather than helped to progress. This particular place says that everything that it does has to be geared to lifelong learning for this group. And it was actually founded by a parent who was astonished to discover that when her son with autistic spectrum disorder and profound learning disabilities left school, there was absolutely nothing for him. And she said, why should this section of the population be the only group for whom there is no lifelong learning? This is the group that has the greatest need of it. So she herself set up this centre, and it's funded with a mixture of social work, health and education funding. So Janet's story, and I think this story does illuminate the tensions between the rights of the parents and the quest of the young person for independence and the tensions that arise between. So these are parents who have actually devoted their lives to looking after two children who have quite significant learning difficulties. The language that they use is of constant struggle. And again, this is a very common theme when we talk to parents. We find that a significant minority, I would say approaching 50% of parents, report that they spend their whole lives struggling to secure resources. First of all, battling the local authority for educational provision, then social work and health as people move into adult services. There are, for this group actually, quite strong rights, as I've said. They're the only group at school level who can take rights to appeals to a tribunal. The rest of the population does not have access to this tribunal. And for people who are in the know, it is possible to exert quite a lot of influence via tribunals. The tribunal in Scotland is hedged around with many caveats, so not many people are actually entitled to use it. But the threat of using a tribunal is quite effective still in terms of levering additional resources. And these parents have actually used the threat of tribunal in order to get better provision. But they've also done work themselves, fundraising, and I've called her Mrs. C, she's done telephone help work, she does a lot of voluntary work to help other people. So it's a life's mission. The parents have become, under the Adults with Incapacity Act, they've become the welfare guardians of their two daughters. So under this legislation, all the rights that might accrue to the young adult are actually held by the parent on their behalf. It's an interesting legal provision. It doesn't apply to many people, but the idea is that these people are no longer allowed to make any decisions for themselves in terms of medical rights, the rights to receive or refuse treatment, or to manage their own money, or to engage in sexual relationships. Everything is managed and controlled by their parents on their behalf. And I'm not saying that this is a bad idea, it's used sparingly, you have to go to the court to get the right to become a welfare guardian. But it does mean that the young person has virtually no autonomous rights. And these parents are quite sceptical about the rights agenda. So the mother actually says she has found evidence when her child was at school of, let's say, a dentist who wanted to put in a metal amalgam because it would be less hassle for the young person, it wouldn't need replaced. And the parents stepped in and said, no, any young person would get a proper filling. I want a proper filling for my daughter. And she was told, well, it's not your choice. It's the young person. They get to make that decision. And that was the point at which she decided to become the welfare guardian, because she felt that cuts in the system, less funding, was being used to pit the child or the young person against the adults, and it would result in the child or young person getting less favourable provision. So this is a theme that has come out actually quite a lot in this research. Just moving forward then to thinking about the challenges, and I'm aware of the time, I've got 3 minutes left, so this is good. So the challenges for the future. There certainly are tensions between children and young people's rights. I maybe should have said earlier that in Scotland now, children aged 12 to 15 with capacity have exactly the same rights in law as their parents. But the parents are saying, we really are not 100% happy with this. We don't know how it's going to be used, particularly at a time of public sector cuts. And parents want to protect, but there is, of course, a danger of over-regulation, over-protection. I do think that there is much to learn from this particular centre I was describing in terms of ensuring that all daycare provision is informed by the principles of lifelong learning, and I think there's much to think about there. And there is also a need to think about transitions throughout people's lives. I don't think post-school transitions are particularly well managed for many young people, but the transitional process actually gets worse as you become older and you have to handle it entirely for yourself. In terms of social policy challenges, I would say, this is my view, there is actually a need for much stronger government intervention in the labour market to ensure that there is a place for people with learning disabilities, for example. So in the post-war period, we had quotas, and these were ditched as being very old-fashioned and not working anymore. But in Scotland, we've seen an increasing erosion of sheltered employment and supported employment. So the idea now is that you're on your own. You have the right to participate in the open labour market. Over to you. And of course, this assumes that everybody is able to manage this for themselves. It's very much about individual autonomy, but this can be a very, very harsh world for people to operate in. And as I've shown from the statistics, if we have only 10% of people with learning disabilities having employment, I do think that that statistic speaks for itself. In an almost full employment situation, this really isn't good enough. I also think that we need to revisit social security payments. Basically, what has happened with universal credit is that the system has been made deliberately punitive. Conditionality, so you've got to jump through certain hoops in order to get benefits, has become more and more marked. It's very much a matter, since the crash, of punishing people at the margins for what they had nothing to do with anyway, and they were certainly not beneficiaries of the boom times that lay before. So I would say that we need to have far more supportive benefit systems, because at the end of the day, lack of money, lack of finance is the underlying reason for lack of social power. If you have no financial autonomy, you have no social power. And do you know what? I think I finished on time, so I'm very happy about that. Thank you for listening. And you can find details of all of our previous and current projects on the website there. So thank you very much.